Good evening. In what ways could the economic power and global reach of tech giants undermine or challenge the authority of national governments?
Yanis.
This is nothing new. The great conglomerates that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. Think of Thomas Edison and Westinghouse, Krupp in Germany. They always had more power than the presidents and the prime ministers. This is not what is new. What I find new and very worrying, and that's what I try to bring to the attention of not governments, but citizens primarily, is that now there's a new form of capital, machinery. When Henry Ford created the production lines for the Model T and so on, the machinery that was using was produced in order to produce other stuff, like the Model T. But now, what's inside your phone, again, is machinery, but its business is to modify our behavior and to create whole platforms in which consumers, capitalists, are all vassals, we are all drawn into this. They're not working on behalf of producers. They are capturing producers, they are capturing polities, their algorithmic capital extracts gigantic rents, money, without producing anything. They are not producing anything, they are modifying our behavior. So the moment you enter Amazon.com, you've exited capitalism. You've exited the market. That's not a market. It looks like a market.
It looks like a market, so
but
what
it's
is it?
Not a market.
What is it?
It's, look, think about it. It's like a fiefdom made of digital algorithmic capital. The moment you step in it, you cannot talk to anyone, unless the algorithm of Jeff Bezos matches you with a producer so as to maximize the amount of value that it extracts from you and from the producer. And that value is extracted from the circular flow of income, from the economy, which means that demand for goods and services goes down, jobs become BS, this is a scientific term, and we have stagnation and very low actual investment in the things that society needs.
Okay.
There you are. This is different to what we had 100 years ago.
There has been a shift. Joe Aston, in fact, it was today that the head of Australia's biggest bank, the Commonwealth Bank, made the point that the focus should be on regulating big tech, not focusing on Australian companies like banks, because big tech is where the focus should be.
Geez, we can't do two things at once. We'll just do both of them, feeding.
Well, yeah, I mean,
one of the
there's a point there that everyone in this debate is talking their own book when one party is saying about another counterparty, regulate them. This has been going on forever. But the big tech companies, they're still... It's been 11 years since the G20 made its focus, I think it was in St. Petersburg, making these companies pay tax at the source of their income. And that's what the whole PwC tax leak scandal was about last year. And they still don't. I mean, the major technology companies pay just a negligible amount of company tax in Australia. So that's one of the ways in which we completely fail to regulate them, still.
Right. OK. Ed Husic, you're the minister.
How do you it all up?
Yeah. How do you begin the project of regulating them? And at the essence of the question is, can national governments have sway? Can actually they have influence?
I think on a number of levels it's got to operate. I think it's very difficult for individual governments to do so. I think one of the turning points in my mind, having followed this space for a similar amount of time as what Joe was reflecting on a few moments ago around the taxation arrangements of big tech, and it was something that I did focus on as a parliamentarian, and particularly the way it had an interplay in pricing of products. It was certainly evident to me back then that unless you got governments to work together and agree to work together, you wouldn't really go anywhere quickly. And in particular, the last few months, I went to this AI Safety Summit in London back in November, 30 countries there. It was the first time countries had actually taken seriously the need to look at what's going to be done around AI, particularly not just because of the tech, but what it does in terms of powering companies and the wealth of those companies and the influence of those companies as well. And so I think we've gone through a bit of a turning point. There'll always be a question, there'll always be someone saying, we've got to do it faster, we should have done it yesterday.
Is there an
get all that.
appetite for regulation?
Well, I think across a number of areas, if you look at it, be it what we're seeing right now with the way that Meta is trying to effectively thug the situation around the news media bargaining code.
Okay. So that's in a particular example. What's your power there?
AI. Well, in that case, it's basically us determining where we go to within the framework of the media bargaining laws and whether or not Meta gets designated, and that will require them to come to the bargaining table. That's got to be worked through, as well as on the AI side, making sure that these companies aren't going ahead doing whatever they want, regardless of risk. They've got to be able to take into account what impact their products have on the rest of the country.
Are Meta acting like thugs?
Well, I think they've just basically got used to this approach. They did this a couple of years ago. They withdrew their services. They basically got hounded back They're doing it to the Canadians in one shape or form or another, and it's really up to governments to be able to tag team, because the effects of what they're doing, particularly around social media and the potential for disinformation as well on their platforms, that is serious in terms of the operation of democracies in a year where about half the world's population is going to be going on election.
Jacqui Lambie, do you think Meta are thugs? Are you worried about the power that they have?
Yeah, they're bloody thugs. They're like the banks. Let's be honest, they've got way too much power and you need to do something. I've got kids out there that are highly addicted to this sort of stuff, and it is getting worse, and it needs to be shut down. The misinformation, especially around, especially you see that going on around political elections, things like that. This has got to be stopped. These guys need to be fined, or stand up to them and say, get out then. Get out.
OK, but if you send them out, Stephanie, is that like, can you do that?
Well, you could do it. I mean, we just had in the US a hearing, one of many, and, you know, there's a lot of bipartisan interest in this subject, and they lined up the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter, X, and Snapchat and TikTok, and, you know, sat these men and women down, and one after another, members of the, you know, US Senate said, this is a bill I've co-sponsored with, and each of the bills was co-sponsored with someone from the other political party. So the politicians are out there, they're saying, we've got all of these things we'd like to do, and then the question was to the CEO, do you support this legislation? And one after another, they went down the list and said, Senator, I'm not prepared to support that legislation today, as if you're asking them for the permission slip to regulate them. This is the problem.
Right. So
the US situation is where the rubber hits the road. The online harm movement in Congress, if they really nail particularly Meta on this particular issue, they have the potential to be treated as the next tobacco. But the Australian government isn't doing anything serious. I mean, the news bargaining media code is, I mean, the amount of money we're talking about is risible. Meta is choosing not to pay $70 million anymore. I mean, what's
That's nothing
$70
for
million?
them, right?
I mean, I think Josh Frydenberg spent that much on car parks in Kooyong that were never built. It's if you're solving for a problem in the news media bargaining code that Australian journalism is somehow
So what would you do
in
if you
peril.
were in charge?
Well, I'm not in charge. That's why I get to sit in the cheap seats and just opine constantly.
Hey, that's not a cheap seat. Honestly, though, what should they do?
Well, can I give one example to the minister in particular? How about charging a tax, a digital tax, on the revenues of every transaction, every time anyone pays Facebook money in order to promote their event, their political views, their commercial activities, they should be charged something like 5% on the revenue. That is on the revenue side of things. You cannot regulate the content because, let's face it, the managers of Facebook do not understand the algorithms. It's a bit like in the banking system with the CDOs, with those weapons of mass financial destruction that blew up and the world of finance and brought us to the GFC. The very financial engineers that were creating those derivatives didn't know what was the mathematical formulas within it. So unless we take a view that this kind of capital, which I call cloud capital, algorithmic capital, call it what you may, is a serious threat to our society, our social fabric, our economy, our effective demand, our tax base, and go in a very radical direction, which I'm going to propose now, to say to Facebook, if you want to operate in Australia, you are going to have to deposit a certain percentage of your shares in an Australian sovereign fund, and therefore acquire returns to capital as well as voting power inside that corporation. And if you don't want it, you can bugger off.
Is that something that you... What,
there's this one small problem, and that is that Facebook would destroy the Australian government, just like the mining companies did to the Australian government.
But that's a recipe for simply giving up on the smidgen of an iota of a possibility of democracy.
But this is the power you're talking about.
Yeah,
you're talking
sure.
about incredibly powerful companies.
That's why politics
when
is
you say-
irreplaceable. It's not a technical fix.
Right, I'm interested in that. You say it would destroy the government.
Well, that's what I would do if I was... That's how I would respond if I was in that position.
And that is why the government, any government, has a duty to the Australian people to organise politically a democratic debate for resisting those...
But Joe reckons they can't win it. Ed, can you win it?
I have to say, I've looked at a number of industries where, their actions have got the backs of people up. I fought a few years ago against the gas sector over the prices that they were charging. There's only so far you could push. But tech is different in this country, and I think in most political environments, and picking up on Stephanie's point in the US, there's a lot more focus on doing something about tech, quite distinct to other sectors. And
Quick question. Joe used the term tobacco, and I was like, do you see them as like big tobacco?
Joe says a lot of things I just take on board.
Joe, are they like big tobacco?
Well, if you think about what are parents at home concerned about, and I say this, I'm not a parent, but as I understand it, the things that people are concerned about at home about technology companies is, one, what are they doing to our children, particularly in terms of body image, and really a huge and irreversible emotional damage to the next generation. Two, the bastards don't pay any tax where they make their income. And that can't be fixed easily because the other countries want that income. The fight is...
But you can still tax sales here in Australia done through the internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Facebook in particular.
Yeah.
Well, because right now Australians are paying. We're going to pay for the damage now. That's what we're doing because they're not paying because they have no moral compass.
All right.
That's where we're at.